I'm Bob Hartzler with Iowa State University Extension and Outreach, and today I'm going to be talking about herbicide resistance and the problems it's causing us. And those of you who took in my presentation last year at the ICM conference, there's going to be a little bit of redundancy, but hopefully there'll be some new information presented here. Now, the reason I chose this topic is a couple months ago, the extension weed scientists from the North Central region were having a virtual meeting, and one of my colleagues made the statement that he wasn't sure what to tell farmers anymore. And this was based on the increasing prevalence of metabolism-based resistance. And one of the problems with this type of resistance is it's hard to predict exactly what it's going to do. And so he was in a quandary what to tell farmers. Well, I'm not willing to go that far because if I don't know what to tell people, why am I even here? So I thought I'd address this topic and try to provide a little bit more clarity of what is happening and what we can do about it. So the topics I'm going to cover today are the current status of resistance, briefly describe different resistance mechanisms, review the strategies for managing herbicide resistance, and then discuss how we can move forward to protect the integrity of the herbicides that are a critical component of our production system. So if we look at the global status of herbicide resistance, there are now known to be 514 resistant weeds worldwide. The U.S. has the largest number. We're approaching about 200 resistant weeds here in the U.S. Now, because we're leading the world doesn't mean that our farmers are using the herbicides less efficiently. It's just that we have a lot more acres than most countries, plus we have a large diversity of cropping systems as you move across the country. And with different types of cropping systems, you have different weeds, and so that increases the likelihood of selecting different resistant weeds than if you just had one single cropping system. So the rise in resistant weeds is a concern, but really what is changing things is what we call multiple resistant weeds. And these would be species that have resistance traits that provide resistance to more than one herbicide group. And so if you look at worldwide, there's about 60 species that are resistant to two different herbicide groups. So an example of that would be a weed that's resistant both to glyphosate and, let's say, atrazine. And then there's 20 weeds with three-way resistance, so on and so forth. And then we have one species that's resistant to 7 different herbicide groups. And that is biotypes that has all 7 resistance traits. And so the concern with this is that when we stack these different resistant traits together, we are running out of options. So that's the global status. How are we doing here in Iowa? So Dr. Jha and his students are doing a survey of Waterhemp across the state. They have over 240 populations that they are testing. At this point in time, they've only completed 70 of those populations. But this looks at the resistance in Waterhemp. And you can see that with group 2, that's ALS inhibitors. Group 5 are the triazines. Group 9 is glyphosate. And over 90% of the populations in Iowa are resistant to those herbicides. And then we also have resistance to group 14 and 27. They're at a much lower frequency, but again, they appear to be increasing relatively rapidly across the countryside. So resistance is common across Iowa in Waterhemp. And if we look at the multiple resistance, which really is the game changer, that also is very common. So 100% of the populations were resistant to 2 different herbicide groups. 90% had resistance to 3 herbicide groups, and even with 5-way resistance, we're down to maybe 2 to 3% of the populations. So this multiple resistance, where we lose a significant number of the options that we have to control weeds, is what is the concern as we move forward. So now we're going to talk briefly about the resistance mechanisms. This basically explains why a resistant weed doesn't die. And so weed scientists like to break these mechanisms into 2 main categories. One would be target site based, and the target site for the herbicide is the protein that the herbicide binds to. When that herbicide binds to the protein, it no longer functions, and that can result in plant death. And so with target site mechanisms, the most common is altered target site. So there's a slight change in that protein that prevents the herbicide from binding. So group 2 herbicide resistance, that's ALS inhibitors, that's altered target site. Group 14, group 5 herbicides also. Overproduction, in this case, the resistant weed can produce so much of the target site that it basically dilutes the effectiveness of the herbicide. That is unique to the glyphosate. So that's target site-based resistance. Then we have non-target site-based resistance, and that could be either due to enhanced metabolism or altered translocation and absorption. And it's the enhanced metabolism which is by far the most common of non-target site-based resistance, and that is what we are beginning to face now out in the Iowa countryside. So if we look at the resistance mechanisms in water hemp, break them down by the type of mechanism. If you look on the left, those are the target site-based resistance. So the first resistance identified in water hemp was group 2 herbicides. That was identified in 1993. That coincided with the rise of water hemp as our #1 weed. And then we have group 5, group 14, and group 9. And so those were identified in the 1990s or early 2000s. Then if we look at non-target site-based resistance, those are the mechanisms that have been appearing in the past decade. Triazine resistance due to metabolism was first identified in 2003, but then since 2009, we've had metabolism-based resistance in group 4, 27, and 15 herbicides. So you can see that the non-target site-based mechanisms are those that are appearing at this point of time. So exactly how does metabolism-based resistance work? Well, basically, the resistance biotypes are able to rapidly degrade the herbicide. So they break that herbicide down so quickly that it doesn't reach the target site at toxic concentrations. Now, herbicide metabolism is very common for most tolerant species, such as crops where we use herbicides on. Those crops gain their tolerance by rapidly degrading herbicides. So corn can survive atrazine or metolachlor because it can rapidly metabolize those herbicides. But with weeds, a weed that at one time was sensitive to the herbicide, its enzyme systems have changed, so now it can rapidly degrade that herbicide. How does that occur? Well, this we haven't got a complete understanding at this point in time. There's 2 basically ways it probably occurs. One would be that a resistant biotype has a different version of the enzyme. Cytochrome P450s are very common, and there's several hundreds or thousands versions of these enzymes. Each version metabolizes a different compound. And so what can happen is that a weed that once was tolerant didn't have the form of the enzyme that could degrade the herbicide, but now a resistant biotype is selected that has the version of the enzyme needed to degrade the herbicide. Another way that this metabolism could occur is that the biotype produces a version of the enzyme that can break down the herbicide, but that resistant biotype is able to recognize the presence of the herbicide and kick in the production of that enzyme. Whereas a susceptible biotype, it doesn't recognize the presence of the herbicide, so it doesn't initiate synthesis of that enzyme. So why are we so concerned about metabolism-based resistance? It's because a single metabolism-based resistance trait can provide resistance to multiple herbicide groups. Now, the good thing of target site-based resistance, if you want to call it good, is that if you have an altered target site, that is only going to provide resistance to herbicides that are in that herbicide group. So if you have an altered target site for group 14 herbicide, PPO inhibitors, the only herbicide that trait is going to influence the plant's ability to survive would be a group 14 herbicide. Whereas with metabolism-based resistance, you could select for a weed that had metabolism-based resistance using one herbicide, and the enzymes that are now present in that biotype could metabolize completely different herbicide groups. And so this is why we are concerned about metabolism-based resistance. So I'm going to use some research out of Australia to illustrate this ability of a resistance trait to provide resistance to different herbicide groups. So in this experiment, they used rigid ryegrass, which is Australia's equivalent to our waterhemp in terms of the ability to evolve resistance to different herbicide groups. And so the researchers took a wild type of the rigid ryegrass that was resistant to numerous herbicide groups that had metabolism-based resistance mechanisms, but this wild type population was still susceptible to group 15 and group 8 herbicides. And then they used recurrent selection where they exposed the different generations to lethal doses of the group 15 herbicide. They used pyroxasulfone, which is Zidua. And whereas a breeder would, each generation, select for a biotype that had traits they were looking for, they basically selected a biotype that was able to survive the herbicide. And so they had, they exposed several generations to the pyroxasulfone, took the survivors, exposed those to pyroxasulfone, so on and so forth. And they looked at the increase in resistance with each successive generation. So you can see by the third generation of exposure, they are up to 40% resistance within the population. That is typically when we would call a population resistance, because at 40% resistance, generally the herbicide no longer is going to be providing effective control. So it's not surprising that if you repeatedly expose a population to the herbicide, you're going to select for resistance. But then they took those same populations and exposed them to a group 8 herbicide. The group 8 herbicide has a completely different site of action than the group 15 herbicides. And you can see that they also were selecting for resistance in the group 8 herbicide. So the resistance mechanism that was providing resistance to the group 15 herbicides also provided resistance to the group 8 herbicides. Steve Powles, who is involved with this research, he likes to say that their rigid ryegrass is resistant to herbicides that haven't even been discovered yet. And so this population had not seen a group 8 herbicide before, but because of selection of group 15 resistance, it also developed resistance to the group 8 herbicides. So how do we go about using herbicides to reduce the risk of selecting new resistant biotypes? Well, you could say there's 3 main strategies. First would be continuous use alone. That's really not a strategy. That's just burying your head in the sand. Uh, the other more appropriate techniques would be annual rotation. So let's say in our cropping system, corn soybean rotation, you would choose to use a herbicide group in corn, but you would not use that herbicide in soybeans. The other approach is what we call multiple herbicide groups, where each year of the rotation you're using multiple herbicide groups. Now it's a little more complex than that because you have to make sure that the herbicide groups that you're using are all effective on the weed of concern. So we like to talk about redundant weed control. And so that each of the multiple herbicides is placing significant selection pressure on the population. So this is some research done by Hugh Becky, who was in Canada at the time, and he used modeling to evaluate how effective these strategies would be. And so this is looking at continuous use, and you can see you had a few years, and I just left the x-axis blank. The duration, how many years before you got resistance, would vary with different herbicide groups. But you can see that with continuous use of the herbicide, resistance evolved very quickly. Now, this is what would happen if you rotated every other year. And what the research has shown that basically for every year you don't use the herbicide, you buy a year before resistance doesn't develop. So let's say in this case, if under continuous use of the herbicide, you reach 50% resistance after 4 years, that tells us you would get 50% resistance in 8 years by using rotation of herbicides. And then the use of multiple effective herbicide groups, you can see prolongs the time frame that the herbicide will remain effective, but it's important to note that it doesn't prevent resistance from developing. So that is modeling. Some people like models, some don't. Models are really good if you have the correct data in there, and it's good to see whether or not what they predict there shows up in the field. And so I'm going to show some data that I think supports these results regarding herbicide use patterns. Now, this is a study out of Illinois where Evans, who was a grad student, I believe, of Pat Tranel, but Aaron Hager and several others were involved in this study. So in 2010, they went to fields in central Illinois and collected Waterhemp populations and determined whether or not the Waterhemp in these individual fields was resistant to glyphosate. Now, the interesting part of this study is that they were able to get the herbicide records for each field for, I believe, 6 years prior to when they collected that Waterhemp. And they were able to look for correlations between how the herbicides were used and the presence of resistance. And the big finding that they came up with was that the use of multiple herbicide groups was effective at delaying resistance. So in fields where the farmers averaged less than 2 herbicide groups per year, 80% of those fields had glyphosate-resistant Waterhemp. Whereas fields where more than 2 herbicide groups per year had been used, only 15% had glyphosate-resistant Waterhemp. So this clearly supports the premise that multiple herbicide groups can delay resistance. They saw no benefit in this study to the use of rotating herbicides. So with the rotating herbicides, they had similar level of resistance as in those fields where farmers use less than 2 herbicide groups per year. And we can look at other research and also from our experience to get a better handle on some of these other strategies with continuous herbicide use, looking at Waterhemp and glyphosate again. One of Kevin Bradley's students in Missouri looked at a water hemp population. It was the first water hemp population that evolved resistance to glyphosate. And this was in a field that had been in continuous Roundup Ready soybeans since their introduction. And after 6 years of relying solely on glyphosate, the glyphosate-resistant water hemp appeared. With the rotation, here I'm just sort of looking at the results from the Illinois study and speculating that rotation probably held out for 10 or 12 years before it failed. And then with multiple resistance, basically looking at when glyphosate started to fail on water hemp in the majority of fields here in Illinois and Iowa, came up with a figure of 16 to 18 years. So you can see that the multiple effective herbicide groups is effective at delaying resistance, but it's important to recognize it doesn't prevent resistance. Now, another interesting study recently was published out of Australia, and they were working with rigid ryegrass. And again, rigid ryegrass is the species that has resistance to the most herbicide groups, so it's resistant to 14 different herbicide groups. Metabolism-based resistance is very common. So the researchers here went out and collected 140 populations from farm fields in Australia, and they evaluated the effectiveness of using tank mixes to control those populations. And they came up with a rating scheme that if a herbicide treatment provided greater than 95% control, or saying the other way, you had less than 5% survival, they classified that population as susceptible. If there was 6 to 20% survival, that was classified as developing resistance. And if it had more than 20% survivors, it was classified as resistant. So here I'm just going to present two possible outcomes of this type of resistance, of this type of research. Now, the first is on the left, where we would say that the cross resistance was common. And so that would mean that the resistance mechanism that provided resistance to one herbicide group was providing cross resistance to the other herbicide group. And if cross resistance is common, there'd be very little value of tank mixing. So here we have herbicide A, and you can see with it, there's about 10% resistant population. With herbicide B, looks like there's about 65% resistance. But when we tank mix the herbicide, there's very little value in managing those populations because the level of resistance was very similar to the resistance you saw with herbicide B alone. So this basically is telling us that whatever the resistance mechanism for, let's say, herbicide A, it also is providing resistance to the herbicide B. So very little value to tank mixing. Now, if cross resistance was uncommon, when you tank mix those herbicides, that would provide effective control of the majority of the populations. And so you can see with the tank mix, maybe 2% of the populations were rated as resistance, and you had fewer developing resistance populations. So in that case, tank mixing would be useful. So that's just illustrating what the researchers were looking for. Now let's look at what the actual results were. So this is looking at pre-emergence herbicides. So they used two different pre-emergence herbicides. Resistance varied from about 3% to 15% to the two herbicides they evaluated. But when they tank mix them, you see that none of the populations were classified as resistant, and only about 5 to 7% were classified as developing resistance. So there was value in using tank mixes of the herbicides. That was pre-emergence herbicides. What happens with post-emergence herbicides? And so here again, you can see the resistance was more common to the post-emergence herbicides they evaluated, ranging from about 25% with one herbicide to 10% in the other. There were a few resistant individuals when they used a tank mix, but again, far fewer than when the herbicides were alone. So even though we know that with metabolism-based resistance, you can have cross-resistance across different herbicide groups. In this research, it's apparent it wasn't all that common in the populations they looked at. So how widespread is cross-resistance in metabolism-based resistant water hemp? Well, we don't have a good handle on that, but we can look at what we've evaluated so far and come up with some conclusions. Now, of concern is that group 15 and group 4 resistant populations in both water hemp and Palmer amaranth have been identified in the past couple years. And what is concerning is that all of those biotypes occurred in group 27 resistant populations. And why that is of concern is that group 27 resistance is not that widespread at this point in time. So it seems like it would be an odd coincidence if there wasn't a link between these two. Group 27 resistance is metabolism-based, and we suspect that the enzymes involved in providing resistance to the group 27 herbicides in these populations also can provide resistance to group 15 and group 4. However, not all group 27 resistance populations provide this cross-resistance, so it doesn't seem to be the rule. And this is where my colleague came up with a statement, is that he wasn't sure what to tell farmers now, because we can't predict based on what we know whether or not a particular population is going to be resistant to multiple herbicide groups. So to summarize, efficient use of herbicides can delay the onset of resistance. Multiple effective herbicides is the best strategy, but you need to carefully evaluate the individual components of those programs to make sure that each herbicide is being used in a way that provides an effective level of control. So we call it redundant weed control, that the first herbicide you use, you want it to be providing 95% control or better of that weed species, and the product you tank mix or apply sequentially, you want it to be providing 95% control or better. And that is a hard sell simply because, the gut feeling is if herbicide A is providing 95% control, why should I use herbicide B? Because A is already doing a great job. Well, if we're going to protect the value of the herbicides, that is the type of strategy we need to use. It's also important to realize that this is a short-term fix, but it's still important. Simply using multiple herbicides is not going to solve the herbicide resistance problem. That's why we need to incorporate alternative tactics into the strategy. So going back to the title of this talk, there's no doubt that an effective herbicide program is not enough, but it's the simplest approach at this point in time, and we need to work closely with growers, trying to help them find alternative strategies that they can work into their system. And I'll finish up with a quote that one of the students in my weed science class came up with while he was summarizing one of our lectures for the Staniforth program. And he basically said that herbicides are like duct tape. They work for a while, but they're just a short-term fix. So I was really happy to see that this student came up with this quote, because I think it's very fitting.